Book 5, Chapter 1. About a year after the adventure with Nellie, Ambrose Merrick at last caught that train from Lupton to Birmingham. He had waited for many years. He had yearned and sickened for the sight of the old land of his fathers. He had not allowed the memory of Gwent to fail. And now, when the whistle sounded and the train began to move out of the station, he was astonished to find himself so little uplifted by the granting of his desires. He looked up with a kind of sober joy at the railway bridge, on which the poor little boy had stood so often for so many hours, straining his eyes towards the west. He remembered that one day when the earth burned as with fire, and his heart and soul and body were faint almost to death. He remembered how he had been refreshed by the vision of the mountain, by the wind that breathed new life into him. It was curious, he thought, how against his own desire and his own faith he had ceased to take daily account of such a merciful marvel as this, which should have been a perpetual talisman, a constant defense against all weariness and sickness and despair, an hourly reminder that the world was not given up entirely to the powers of darkness. He understood the difficulty of the great act of faith, which must be renewed day by day, again and again, by a constant exercise of the will, or else the abyss, the fall into the black pit of nonsense and despair, which most people spoke of as the world, and not half a bad place either, if you take it the right way. It was so simple, the "not half a bad place" creed. One fell in with it so easily, without any conscious effort of acquiescence. One conformed even against one's own steadfast convictions, unless these were continually renewed and proclaimed. One knew better, perhaps. One had been vouchsafed sure proofs from within and from without. And yet it was so entirely natural to believe that man is sustained by loaves from the baker and meat from the butcher, and to take one's measures accordingly. As the train sped away to the west and the south, he resolved that this should be amended, that for the future he would daily remind himself that he was not fed by baker's bread and butcher's meat, but by miracles and wonders. But the past year had been given over to that process of dryness and fear which is called the purgative way. It is needful, but it lacks all refreshment and unction, speaking more of unworthiness and darkness than of light and compassions. He had come back to Lupton after that holiday with a certain mark of grimness about the mouth. He went down into the fire that it might cleanse him. He put away the thought of wonders and mysteries of which he was not worthy. As has been seen from some of his notes, he had already made himself acquainted with the species of voluntary stripping, the giving up of all the decorations and ornaments and vestures of the inner life. But the sense of his guilt and his offense now stripped him in spite of himself, and he became familiar with the dark clouds of desolation. He had professed the mysteries, and he feared lest they should be withdrawn from him forever. For the first time in his school days, he really and interiorly submitted himself to the disciplines of the place. Not that he thought it good or wise or suitable for anything but the production of boobyism, but he accepted it as an instrument of correction, and for a year he had endeavored to occupy himself as much as possible with the interests of Lupton, putting aside, as far as he could, his own life and his own hidden knowledge. But he felt, as the train rushed from Midlandia Maledicta to Midlandia Felix, that enough had been done in the path of penance. The book entitled Here Begin Terrors was closed for a season. It was time to open another volume. Here begin Great Wonders. He was nearly 19. In the autumn he would go up to Oxford for his scholarship examination, but he did not mean to go to the university, at all events for the present. He intended to submit himself to other schools and more remote ways of knowledge. He had made certain vows of reparation for the wrong he had done, and he began to have a glimmering vision of that which might prove to be the purpose and the end of his life. If this were to be so, if indeed he were called to so holy and mystical an office, to the celebration of such high and wonderful ceremonies, with what instant and especial care he must begin to prepare himself, how sternly he must shut out from his heart all the apparatus of vanity and lies. He feared lest he should have bowed down too low in the temple of the false deities, though the motive has been good, but he had tried to listen sympathetically to the doctor's sermons. And what a curse it had been during the last term! The main point enforced had been that one could not arrange one's life in separate compartments without relating the one to the other, that all life was of infinite and equal importance, that the games and work of school were to be regarded just as seriously as the pursuits and labors of later years. "Do not let us mistake," said the preacher one Sunday morning. "We are already inhabitants of eternity, here at Lupton in school and in the playing fields, in our sports and in our studies. Each action is of eternal import. Each action forms part of that character which will be our everlasting possession." And the whole gist of the series was that any boy who wished to be a plausible and successful humbug in afterlife had better set about his great task immediately. "Remember," said the doctor, "we are not in the Dark Ages now. None among us will ever be called upon to be the minister of a capricious and arbitrary sovereign. There is no one here whose gift of statesmanship will be exercised in concocting measures against the liberties of the people. There is no one whose military ability will be utilized in deeds of savage and remorseless oppression. We are not in the Dark Ages. There may be future prelates in your rank for all I know, but the prelate of today is successor in name only to the medieval hierophant. No, we are to serve a sovereign who wears no visible crown. Let us all remember once and for all that there is no more splendid service than that of the people, that if we win high place and high honors, these things are but held by us in trust for the benefit of our brothers and sisters, that work which is useless to the multitude is not work at all, or, at the best, is work which is not worth the doing. We talk of the Church as if the word were synonymous with the clergy. How foolish! How erroneous! The Church is merely the state in its ethical persona. It represents the state by morally energizing, endeavoring to touch the great heart of the people to higher issues and nobler aims. The Church, as the state, derives all its power, all its authority, from those whom it serves. Again I say, distrust, and distrust profoundly, all work, all service, that cannot abide the great popular test which I have indicated. Distrust yourself if you are not doing the people's work. Reconsider your position. Come down from the heights and take your place with the striving multitude below. Remember once and for all that popularity, in its true sense, is a noble aim. Nay, it is the noblest of all aims. What wonder that the Jewish populace cried Hosanna? He had compassion on the multitude. The common people heard him gladly. Let these words dwell in the minds of all of us, more especially in the minds who are soon to take their share of the great work of the world. Let us all beware. We are not to work for cliques, for small and select aristocratic bodies, however exquisite their taste, however high their standards. We are to work for and speak to the multitude, the common people. We are to win popularity. Ambrose shuddered and laughed at the recollection of this discourse and others like it. It was clear that he had had enough of such follies, and it was time for him to leave behind Lupton and all its ways. Already it seemed to belong to things departed. He would return for a little while at the end of the holidays and go through such formalities as were necessary, but Lupton was over. Its foolish routine, its magazines of cant, its dull pedantries, its sense of being at the center of all things. It was all past and performed, and lay in his mind like the recollection of a tedious and unimportant play, that one has witnessed and would willingly forget. Behind him all this weariness, its dolours and its languors, its pain and longings, behind him also the evil that he had done, which had so heavily and grievously weighed down his spirit. Before him was the land of desire, the end and the goal and the perfection. He was not 19, but already, it seemed, the call had come. He looked forward to his stay at the Wern as a time of refreshment and preparation for the work that he had to do. He was to revisit his old home. When his father had died, Mr. Horbury, who was the trustee, had bethought him of some distant cousins of the Merricks, people named Vaughan, whom, he thought, might be glad to take the old place during Ambrose's minority. Mr. Vaughan, a widower with one daughter, was delighted with the proposal. The rent was moderate, the air was good, and he had pleasant recollections of the Wern dating from a visit paid long before. It was an admirable arrangement for both sides. The rent was secure, and Mr. Horbury, who liked managing, and always managed well, felt that Ambrose was lucky to be in such good hands. Indeed, he was quite right. He invested Mr. Merrick's capital in some excellent securities, and when Ambrose came of age, he found himself not only the owner of the pleasant and beloved old house, but also the possessor of a very pretty balance at the bank, the accumulation of 10 or 11 years, after due deduction of his school fees, board, and general expenses. It has been hinted that there were defects in Mr. Horbury's character, but there was never better or more scrupulous man of affairs. Mr. Vaughan, the cousin, was an odd and retired character. One of the reasons which made him welcome the chance of taking the Wern was the fact of its remoteness from a railway station. He hated trains, and never wanted to take them, spending his time in a little shooting, a good deal of fishing, and the writing of an interminable romance, which had kept him quiet for 25 years. Nothing much was known of it, save that the author was always consulting Ducange's Lexicon of late Latinity. This did not seem very promising, and the ingenious author had neither the energy nor the guile of a brother of the craft, whose autumn paragraphs about the magnum opus in preparation appeared as regularly as the blackberries. Perhaps it would have been kinder if Mr. Vaughan had asked his cousin to spend the holidays at the Wern before, but the idea had not occurred to him. He supposed that Horbury was looking after the lad all right. At last, however, it had struck him that an invitation would be graceful, and perhaps at 19 Ambrose would no longer be a loud boy. Mr. Vaughan hated loud boys, and thought they spoilt life. He understood that they had to be fed on underdone mutton and rice puddings. They were always shouting. They never ceased from shouting from 5 o'clock in the morning till 11 o'clock at night, he persisted, and continually rushing about in staring white flannels. Nonsense, he would say. I know them. They do shout, and they never stop. I'd much rather live next to the kennels than next to a school. And what the devil do they mean by dressing in that absurd style? It's glaring. It's offensive. It's excessively silly. And why do they rush? What's the good of it? What do they get by it? I've noticed them. They can't walk like sensible people. They're always rushing, and it's most tiresome to look at. Moreover, they never, by any chance, know any single thing that can be of the faintest interest to any rational being. I have a black pig that could talk down a schoolboy any day. His name is Walter Mapp, and he is extremely intelligent. I value his companionship. He often goes out for walks with me. I would not take a loud boy out for a walk on any terms or conditions or considerations whatsoever. He would dress in white flannel, he would put a hideous stripy jacket on top, he would shout and rush all the way, he would high jump all the stiles, and a long jump all the brooks. He would stop now and then, and go through a most ridiculous pantomime with his walking stick, and roar out some rubbish about that being the way to meet bogglers bowling. He would not utter one word of the remotest approach to the distant boundaries of sense, if I walked him to the top of Bannawc Brycheiniog and back again. Damn the loud boy, and damn his masters for encouraging him to make such a fool of himself. Walter Map, now. Perhaps these sentiments had weighed largely in the forgetfulness of Mr. Vaughan towards his cousin. Even now he had tremors, especially after reading Mr. Horbury's last letter, in which Ambrose had been highly commended, not only for his brilliant scholarship, but more especially for his proficiency in games. "I have great hopes," wrote Mr. Horbury, "that he will make a big name for himself and do the old school credit. He will have a nice little income at his back when he comes of age, so he will be able to pick and choose his own career. So many of us have to take what we can get, and sometimes that means that our real abilities run to seed for lack of opportunity. Ambrose will be differently placed. He can afford to wait and look about him. He is a really fine scholar, and besides the ordinary schoolwork, I fancy that he has read a good deal on his own account. I don't see how he can miss his first, even if he tries. But what is more important than mere scholarship, he is good at all our games, and his fast bowling will, I expect, do even more than his Greek verse to place him, first at the university, and then in the world. It may seem illogical enough, but as a matter of fact, athletics will carry a man farther than any amount of scholarship, and it is in this account that I feel so confident of Ambrose's future." The letter had filled Mr. Vaughan's mind with the most dismal apprehensions. He sincerely regretted the invitation. He meditated a diplomatic indisposition, but concluded that it would be better to suffer the young man for a time. If necessary, he could have all his meals sent into the study on the plea of writing a book. He would not, on any pretext, allow Ambrose to practice bowling on the lawn. That was settled, and Sylvia might hint that her father found shouting disturbed him when he was writing. But Mr. Vaughan looked pensive after sending that letter, and he was quite uneasy at breakfast on the day of Ambrose's expected arrival. Ambrose had written that he was not quite certain of his train. He would walk from the station, so there was no necessity to send anyone to meet him. He would carry a handbag, and his luggage could be fetched the next day. He wished to re-enter his native land alone, as lovers desire but each other when they are reunited after long years of absence. By the time that the train reached Hereford, Lupton had vanished from his mind and all recollections of it. He had been exiled, and he was returning, and when the great hills rose up before him, a strange emotion beat within his breast. He did not know the precise boundary of the counties, but at the sign of the hills he took off his hat, worshipping the dear soil of Gwent. The land had an unutterable word for him, and all his being made answer. The earth kept that day a quiet festival. He could almost have said, Montes exulteraverunt ut aeretes, et coles sicut agni ovium. It was a day of soft sunshine behind a delicate veil. The land was all in a golden, wonderful radiance, and the clear streams glittered in the light, and the leaves of the trees danced with exultation in a wind blowing from the west. He looked out of the carriage window with a gaze of such ardor and delight as lovers know. Qui convertit petrum in stagna aquarum, et rupum in fontes aquarum. His sojourn in the dry and stony land was ended. There rushed the translucent brook down from the mountainside, from the very heart of the rock. He fancied that he could hear the sound of the pouring waters and their voice of gladness. There was the glen which led to the wild country, the land of green bubbling wells, and the far purple fields of heather, and the world of the golden scented gorse, where the great rocks looked like magic druid rings. He and his father had climbed by that little path so many years ago to see a church of very old religion, and the well of an old saint. The brook rushed on. The line ran parallel with it for some miles. He feasted his eyes on that wonderful clear stream. He had seen no such sight since the day on which he had left Gwent, for about Lupton most of the rivers and brooks were poisonous sewers, and even the unpolluted waters were dull and muddy and sluggish, as they crawled through dull fields. Here was quick crystal, which sang laetare as it passed from the hill into the valley. Its pools were a shining darkness, its ripples were of silver light. It was pure as the dawn upon the mountains. It was as if the great alchemy of God had transmuted the hard innermost rocks with all their secrets into that rejoicing brightness, signifying how before the day of ruin all the world was a plastic light, an ever-changing mirror. On his left hand was now the hill of the apparition of St. Michael the Archangel, a strange riven height venerated by the people before the coming of the Black Hag of Geneva, who sends body and soul quick to hell. Here, they said, in the old days, those who knew would sometimes go apart, climbing the red height till they came to the chapel of the Archangel, a very small and ancient place, of which the foundations still remained, standing in a thick wood of ash trees. This observance, it has been said, furnishes the explanation of the curious poem by Morvran, called The Sovereignty of the Ash. Ambrose, as he gazed up towards the mountain, could see the wood, the boughs of the ash trees tossing in the wind, and he remembered the poem, a strange piece of metrical ingenuity in the original, which had served as a model to many generations of bards, though none had ever equalled it in the complexity of its structure. In its lines, Morvran had mingled alliteration and rhyme and assonance in a wonderful manner, and as the poets said, besides all this, there were inspiration and unction of such a singular magic that it was sometimes spoken of as the supreme incantation of Morvran. The poem represents all the trees as contending for the honor of sovereignty. As the first hues of the dawn above the forest of Cor-arbennic, there appeared a red blossom out of the shadow of the trees. The rose spoke. It was like the clear chant of the angels. Though I am least of the trees of the wood, though I am hidden and overshadowed in the wood, though I dwell often in obscurity, yet I claim principality in this assemblage, because I alone am a native of the old garden, because I typify the accomplishment of the saints, because in my blossom is hidden the great mystery, because I waft abroad sweet odors of paradise, ancient relics of the lost kingdom. The hazel boasts that its boughs are the choir of the birds of God, the wych elm of its use in magic. The oak has borne sway from all ages. The whitethorn is the shining house of Merlin. The yew has an honorable station near the altars of the saints. And so the poem ranges through all the trees of the wood till the ash triumphs. Because I keep watch over the shrine of the chief angel, because beneath my boughs shone the majesty of heaven, because I was a veil to the glorious appearance, because I was visited by heaven's principal warrior, Machen is my advocate, the bearer of the offering, unto the supreme altar of the Most High. Ambrose was murmuring these last lines to himself as the train passed the base of the Mount of Apparition, and the men who had got in at Hereford glanced round nervously and looked at the cord of communication. But Ambrose looked longingly at the boughs of the ash, tossing in the wind on the far mountainside, thinking of the stories told of those who retired to this shrine in the dark ages. Before what was called the flaming picture of the chief angel, these vowed persons would remain 3 whole days and nights in silent devotion, wrapped, so the legend said, far out of the earthly regions and raised to the heavenly places, to the state of paradise, so that when they came down again to the valleys and lower places of the world, they were as those who had voyaged in the blessed isles, since their garments were scented with celestial odors, and about them was the visible shining of light. The train rushed on through the rich and happy meadows, by the wild thickets, by the shimmering fields of corn, by the old white farms. Before his eyes now rose that well-remembered and venerable Mynydd Mawr. High upon it he could see the line of straggling beeches and the walls of Craddock's house, gleaming in the sunlight. His heart thrilled at the thought of that which rested there, concealed in a dark place, of the holy cup in its glistening veils of samite. It was as yesterday that he bent low before those ghostly splendors, and saw the images of immortal things that showed in the crystal mirror of the blessed work. The golden wood, resounding with the magic summons of the bells, the far-lifted sanctuary of Cor-arbennic, high above the ninth wave, the vision of the saints of Britain sailing on the fairy sea to Avalon. He could scarce see the great dome of the mountain above him, scarce rejoice in the deep woods below, scarce fix his eyes on the white walls by the beeches for the recollection of these clearer marvels that had appeared before him. He felt as though a voice cried to him from that place. The cup seemed to summon him to kneel once more and to behold new visions. Craddock's house passed out of sight, and there rose the great wall of Mynydd Main, and far down to the south, Twym Barlwm, the lofty height that looks far over land and sea, where the wind is like strong wine. He sank back in the seat and wondered how he could have borne that long and dreary exile. Facti sumus sicut consolati, veniens autumn venient cum exultatione, portantos manipulos suos. He had wondered still more deeply by what compassions he had been preserved in that house of folly which he had inhabited, which he had entered, helpless and defenseless, a little lonely child. How was it that he had not been ruined utterly, that he had not become a practical man, longing for a time when he should be able to do some great work in the world, say, by sitting in the House of Commons? There were lads of his own age who were already bubbling over with enthusiasm in the cause of humanity, who were already beginning to count the rewards that really earnest, disinterested work for one's fellow man seldom fails to procure. They pointed to young Hasley, an old Luptonian who had changed sides twice and was certain to be in the next cabinet of his party, though he was barely 30. Many of the boys, taking the doctor's solemn warnings to heart, had already made friends who would be useful in later life, useful, that is, in forwarding them in their desire to do some good in the world. Ah, how had he escaped from this cesspool, from the discipline and teaching of the masters and the companionship of the boys, without losing his soul forever? Through his father's teaching and the mercy of the compassionate, he said to himself. But what a marvel it was! He had been 9 years at Lupton, and still, and with ever greater awe and adoration, he remembered and venerated the mysteries of the cup of Tylo Sancte.